I've always had an unusual group of friends. Most of them chose rugged, hands-on careers like logging, working on oil rigs, and construction. Meanwhile, I'm the odd one out of our high school clique. I ended up in IT. They're always ribbing me about my nerd work, and I fire back with something like, "Me no likey computer." I dig. It's an unlikely dynamic, but somehow it works. So there we are, gathered in a bar. This is one of those rare moments when everyone's back in town, and we're all drinking, trading stories about the dangers of our jobs. One friend recounts the time part of their oil rig exploded, tragically claiming 3 lives. Another, Hank, a real lumberjack, shares how he witnessed a coworker lose an arm to a log line. It was a horrifying scene. The limb was gone in an instant. Hank did what he could, using a shirt to try to stem the bleeding, but the man didn't survive long enough for help to arrive. I sit quietly, listening. I have my own story, but it's not one I usually share, especially with a group like this. It's the kind of memory that feels too eerie to voice, like it might somehow take on a life of its own if I speak it aloud. I keep it locked away in the back of my mind, like a dangerous animal in a cage. But tonight, as everyone finishes their stories, all eyes turn to me. It's obvious I haven't shared anything, and their amused looks seem to say, "Well, let's hear it." Ignoring the voice in my head warning me not to, I clear my throat. My voice cracks as I say, "I've got one." Their surprised expressions push me forward. I work remotely from my home, which is on 30 acres of land just outside a small Alaskan town. I live alone, no kids. The city revolves around a tiny liberal arts college of a few hundred students, surrounded by natural beauty that draws people in. The campus borders reservation land, with the local tribe acting as stewards for the expansive forest trails. My property is adjacent to the college grounds on the opposite side. One sunny afternoon, I was outside near the tree line at the edge of my property, watering some raised garden beds about 200 yards from the house. That's when it happened. From somewhere deep in the woods came a strange sound. It resembled a distorted recording of someone speaking, a garbled mix of syllables, like a poor phone connection where the words barely come through. I stood there, hose still running, just listening. I wasn't scared, only curious. Looking back, I think my casual attitude delayed my reaction. Strange things, supernatural things, aren't supposed to happen in broad daylight, especially in your backyard. After about half a minute, the sound stopped. I turned off the water and waited to see if it would start again. Nothing. I shrugged it off as an oddity, something I might casually mention later or, more likely, forget entirely. That was my first mistake. A few weeks later, I was hiking on a trail at the back of my property. It was one I'd started clearing the previous summer, though it was already becoming overgrown. The weather was perfect, and I was lost in thought under the canopy of trees when I heard it again. Far off in the woods, that same garbled sound came, like human speech distorted beyond recognition. The surrounding forest felt unnaturally quiet. I'm not one to take risks, so I casually turned and headed back toward the trailhead. No sudden movements, I didn't want to provoke a predator, just in case. Whatever was making that noise could wait. I decided to bring Hank along when he visited in 2 weeks to investigate together. Except 2 weeks later, Hank bailed on me. Typical. I told him that if anything happened to me, I'd haunt him for the rest of his life. Still, there I was, standing at the trailhead, staring down the same quiet path. I checked my pack. Bear spray and a shiny new Bowie knife that I didn't know how to use. It's just a sound, I told myself, and started walking. An hour into the hike, I heard the faint but unmistakable noise again coming from just off the trail ahead. Unlike before, the forest felt alive, rustling and moving in its usual way. Reassured, I pressed on. The noise grew louder as I approached. My hand instinctively went to the knife, but as I reached the source, I didn't see anything unusual at first. The garbled babble continued, now accompanied by a faint crackling sound. Then I saw it. A small black speaker mounted about 10 feet up in a tree. Relieved, I released my grip on the knife and stepped closer. The speaker's side had the college's name and forestry department painted on it. So that was it. Mystery solved. Feeling both silly and relieved, I headed home. The next week, curiosity got the better of me, and during a lull in work, I called the college forestry department. Yes, I'd like to speak to the dean. No, I'm not a student. No, they don't know I'm calling. The dean answers in a tone that suggests boredom, but he seems eager enough to chat, as though my call is the most interesting thing that's happened to him all day. As it turns out, the speaker I found was part of a discontinued art project. Students were able to write and record their poems, which the speakers would then play in the forest. It was solar-powered, but he suspected the connection to the speaker had failed. Originally, someone was supposed to update the MP3 files at the base of each tree once a semester. He explained that the project was shut down after complaints from the local tribe. At first, the college ignored their concerns, but persistent objections eventually reached the vice president, who didn't want to risk harming relations with the tribe. It seemed they must have missed the speaker I found when they dismantled the others. Mystery solved. The rest of the hiking season passed without incident. After the snow finally melted, about a month later, I decided to hike the same trail where I'd found the speaker. This time, I planned to camp overnight near my turnaround point a few hours in. As I hiked, I almost didn't notice the silent speaker about an hour into the trail. Its electronics looked worn out, likely from winter's harsh conditions. Shrugging, I moved on. A couple of hours later, I had set up camp and prepared a simple meal. It was late afternoon, but with daylight still left, I felt restless and decided to explore beyond my usual turnaround point. I picked a side trail that led uphill, hoping for a good view. The afternoon sun bathed the forest in a warm glow as I walked. The weather was perfect. My mind drifted, soaking in the serenity, and I thought, damn, this is nice, but then I heard it. That same unsettling sound, faint and distant. I froze on the trail, my brain sluggishly processing what I was hearing. The sound seemed clearer and sharper than before, as if the crackling distortion of the first speaker was gone. I moved closer, stepping off the trail slightly to hear the words. It was a woman reading poems, just like the dean had described. Feeling less unnerved than I had been before, I sat on a rock near the source, pulled out my water bottle, and rested. The forest sounds mingled with the poetic voice, creating an oddly eerie atmosphere. After a few minutes, though, the unease crept back in, and I decided to move on. I packed my water bottle, stood up, and that's when I heard it. Another voice. This one wasn't coming from the speaker. It was close, too close. A strange babbling noise, nonsensical and warped. The pitch shifted unnaturally, rising and falling in the wrong places like a person trying to mimic speech but getting it all wrong. The forest around me fell deathly silent, as though a switch had been flipped. I stood frozen, listening to the bizarre sound as it moved through the dense brush ahead of me. My breath caught as I whispered, "What the hell?" Something moved in the brush, and for a brief moment, I caught sight of it. That's when my instincts took over. Before my brain could fully register what I had seen, my body was already moving, propelling me down the trail at full speed. As I ran, the realization hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just movement in the brush. It was hand, elongated and grotesque, reaching through the foliage. The babbling voice belonged to whatever was attached to that hand. Then I heard it again, closer now, mimicking my own words in that warped, eerie tone. What the hell? Panic consumed me. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted back toward camp, branches scratching at my arms and legs. My nerves were frayed, every sense on high alert. I reached the clearing and slowed down cautiously. My eyes darted to the tent, still standing in the shadowy clearing with its flaps slightly open. Packing it up would take 10 minutes, maybe less. I stared at it for half a second before deciding. Nope, I kept running. Back on the main trail, I settled into a sustainable jog. But after a short distance, I froze again. The forest was silent, more silent than I'd ever experienced. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. The oppressive quiet enveloped me, stifling and unnatural. It felt like a glass dome had been placed over me, sealing off the world. My breath quickened as my heart pounded against my chest. The air hung heavy and still, suffocating me in the heat of the summer afternoon. For a moment, I thought about moving, but my gut screamed at me not to. This wasn't the feeling of being watched. It was the sense of being examined and studied. I stood perfectly still, doing what every other creature in the forest seemed to be doing. Waiting, hoping. I didn't dare run. Whatever it was, this wasn't something you outrun. I had to survive. I stay frozen, mid-step, mid-breath, not even daring to blink. It feels like I'm a mannequin, trapped in an unnatural pose, while something unseen watches me through the cracks, trying to decide if I'm real or just a clever imitation. For what feels like an eternity, I stand there, paralyzed, my mind spinning with terror. 10 seconds. My lungs start to ache as I fight the urge to breathe. 20 seconds. My heart pounds relentlessly as the unseen force examines me. Then, as suddenly as it came, its focus shifted. The sensation of being watched lifted, and my vision narrowed as my oxygen-starved brain struggled to keep me upright. In the distance, I heard a rustling noise, a great exhale that seemed to sweep through the forest like a wave. The sounds of the forest return all at once, flooding my senses. I bend over, hands on my knees, gasping for air as though I've been holding my breath for hours. The walk back to my property is a blur of restrained panic. Every snapping twig sets me on edge, but I force myself to maintain a brisk but steady pace. I know I can't run the whole way. By the time I reach my land, the sun has dipped low, casting long shadows over everything. In the bar, my friends are silent, their faces slack with disbelief. None of them have touched their drinks in minutes. I sit there, my hands trembling, absent-mindedly running my fingers through my hair. It was like I trail off, struggling to find the words. It was like staring down the barrel of a gun, but not one you could see. I pause, taking a long sip of my beer, then continue. If I'd moved, even a little, I wouldn't be here now. It would have known I was there. It would have known I was real. I glance at them, their stunned expressions speaking volumes. And I never went back for that tent, I add, trying to lighten the mood. A few of them manage weak, nervous chuckles, but for the most part, they're staring at their drinks or the table, avoiding my eyes. Man, one of them finally mutters. Yeah, I reply softly. We leave the bar not long after, paying our tabs in near silence. As we step outside, one of my friends pulls me aside. Was all of that true? I mean, really true. I look up at the stars for a long moment, searching for the right response. Finally, I say, there's stuff out there no one can explain. Things that don't have names. And now and then, someone stumbles across one. The lucky ones, like me, get to tell their stories. He studies me for a moment, then nods, seemingly satisfied. Night, he says, heading for his car. Of course, I didn't tell him everything. I didn't tell him it wasn't just some invisible force staring me down in the woods. It was a creature, a lanky, monstrous thing that bore only a passing resemblance to a human. That day, I was given two gifts. The first was my life. The second was the gift of barely seeing the creature, keeping it at the edge of my vision. Afterward, I dove into research, uncovering disturbing details. There was a report of a missing homeless man, and later, dismembered remains were found scattered in the forest. Not a whole body, just parts. I also learned about something called a via condixity, or at least that's how it sounded to me. That piece of information came from a follow-up call to the dean, which led to a meeting with the grandson of the shaman who'd urged the college to take down the speakers. We met the next day. I don't know how well I can explain it, he said, hesitant. I don't think about it the same way my grandfather does. Try me, I urged him. You know how all living things share some of the same DNA? If you go back far enough, we all have a common ancestor, even things as different as bacteria and humans. Well, I think via condixity is somewhere on that tree too. But they come from something else. He trailed off, watching for a reaction, maybe expecting skepticism. But I had no reason to doubt him, not anymore. These things aren't a joke, he said, wrapping his hands around a cup of coffee. People at the college think my grandfather's crazy. They only listen to him because of his status in the tribe. Even in the tribe, though, most people think he's out of his mind. Do you? I asked, studying his face. His expression shifted, his voice steady. No, he's not crazy. I saw one myself years ago, 5 or 6 years back. I was riding an ATV through the woods, weaving between trees. I was stupid back then, doing reckless stuff. I was riding my ATV through some sparse woods, the kind where you can see a long way off. That's when I spotted something lying in the distance. I turned the ATV toward it, and as I got closer, I could tell it was a deer. I cut the engine and let the ATV roll to a stop about 20 feet away. At first, I thought it must be injured because its back legs weren't working, and it was dragging itself forward with its front legs. Figuring I'd need to put it out of its misery, I reached down to grab my knife. But as soon as I moved, the thing's head snapped toward me. And I don't mean it turned its head to look around at the sound. I mean it jerked straight toward me instantly. That's when I realized something was wrong. It didn't look right. It was like someone tried to make a deer but didn't get the details correct. Its body was twisted and awkward, and its swollen eyes seemed unnaturally large. It stared at me with this intense, almost calculating gaze as if it were trying to figure out what I was. After a few seconds, it turned away and dragged itself further into the woods. Wow, I say, genuinely amazed by the story. He nodded, his face serious. I got on my ATV and pushed it as fast as it would go to get back to the house. When I told my grandfather what I saw, he explained it to me. He said those things are called via condixity. They're bad spirits that come from deep in the forest. They're drawn to signs of life, things like movement, sound, and light. When they find something alive, they try to copy it, but they break it apart first. And once they make a copy, they keep looking for more to make a better one. I don't know why. That's just what he told me. He paused, taking a breath. Most of the time, they don't bother anyone. But occasionally, one will show up mimicking a deer, a dog, or something else. When that happens, men from the tribe go out to deal with it. So what did they do about the one you saw? Asked. They went out to find a real deer. Once they caught one, they brought it to the via condixity. The only way to kill them is to make them copy something that's already dying. We sat there in silence for a moment, our drinks forgotten. I saw one, I finally said. What? He asked, surprised. And I think I know why your grandfather wanted the speakers taken down. I think I know what he was afraid of. What happened? He demanded, leaning closer. There's a human via condixity out there. A few hours later, We stood at the trailhead behind my apartment. The sun was sinking fast, leaving us with about an hour of daylight. A group of men from his tribe were gathered nearby, speaking in hushed tones. Behind them, several women and children stood, some of the women softly crying. "Ida, what's going on?" I whispered. He didn't answer immediately. He just motioned for me to wait as the circle of men broke apart. An older man in his early 60s, who I guessed was Ida's grandfather, walked toward us from the group. He didn't stop to speak. He just gave a brief nod in our direction before continuing down the trail. Despite his age, he was wiry and strong, and his feathered garb and war paint gave him an imposing presence. As he passed, I noticed an ornate stone dagger hanging from his belt. After a moment, I finally asked, "When's he coming back?" Ida gave me a flat, mournful look. "He isn't coming back." His words sank in, and I remembered what he'd told me earlier. The only way to kill them is to make them copy something already dying.